So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Michel Foucault's essay, What is an Author? So we've already had two lectures in this particular text, so we'll just continue with this in this lecture and hopefully wind up in the next few lectures to come. So we're looking at the relationship between author and authority, and how the idea of the author is a pretty modern phenomenon, and what are the postmodern implications of the term author, etc. These are the questions which have come up already in this particular essay. And now in the section that we're going to start with today, Foucault examines the notion of ownership that has come with the idea of authorship, right? So the relationship between ownership and authorship is something that he examines in some details, and also the entire legality which is invested into the formation of the identity of the author. So the author has a legal function, the author has a societal function, the author has a cultural construct. So these are the questions which Foucault examines in this particular session that we will cover today. So it should be on the screen at the moment. So in this section where he starts to analyze the author function, so what are the implications, what are the very complex ramifications and extensions of the author function in the world that we live in today, is what the Foucault is examining in this particular section. So he goes on to say, and I quote him, this should be on the screen: "Let us analyze this author function as we have just described it. In our culture, how does one characterize a discourse containing the author function?" So, looking at the discursivity of the author function is something where we discussed in some details in our last lecture as well. The relationship between authority, author, and discursivity, authorship and discursivity. The author is a discourse, the identity of the author, the formation of the author is a discourse, a discursive function. And now he's examining the discursive function of the author in our society. In what way is this discourse different from other discourses? If you limit our remarks to the author of a book or a text, we can isolate 4 different characteristics. So he's sort of giving you 4 different models, 4 different traits of the author discourse that is functional in a society we live in today. So what are the 4 different discursive narratives that are invested into the idea or the identity of the author? First of all, discourses are objects of appropriation. So we've seen already the word appropriation is a very loaded word, especially in cultural studies. It means taking over. It means assuming something, assuming authority, assuming a certain identity, etc. But appropriation can often result in misappropriation, and more often than not, appropriation ends up being a misappropriation. You either assume something excessively or inadequate. There's always a gap between the original and the assumed identity, and it's something we've seen already in Homi Bhabha, in the essay that we read some time ago, the other question, where the question of the idea of appropriation becomes crucial, especially in colonial politics. But over here is looking at appropriation when it comes to author formation or author identity formation, which operates as a discursive function. So appropriation becomes a key term. Discourses are objects of appropriation. The form of ownership from which they spring is of a rather particular type, one that has been codified for many years. We should note that historically, this type of ownership has always been subsequent to what one might call penal appropriation. So penal appropriation or legal appropriation or punitive appropriation is something that comes before the idea of appropriation of the author. So again, we're looking at the very interesting collusion between the law and authorship, a law and authority, right? So who writes a book? Who's accountable for a book? Who's accountable for the content of a particular book? These become very key questions in modern parlance as Foucault examines it. So texts, books, and discourses really began to have authors other than mythical sacralized and sacralizing figures, to the extent that the authors became subject to punishment. That is, to the extent that discourses could be transgressive. So in order to punish a discourse, in order to punish a transgressive act, it was essential, Foucault examines, to identify the author of the particular act, the author of the particular discourse, who could be pinpointed and held accountable for the transgression. So the author becomes a containing function, one might argue. The author becomes a very convenient marker for a particular discourse. If a discourse becomes transgressive, we can trace it back to the author and hold the author accountable for that transgression and punish him or her accordingly. So the author becomes a punitive function. Okay, so it's an example of penal appropriation, right? So legal appropriation becomes a penal code to a certain extent. And again, we are back to talking about the idea of codification. So the author becomes a code corresponding to a particular discourse, right? So if a particular discourse becomes transgressive, if the content of a discourse becomes transgressive or subversive or problematic to the status quo, we can trace it back to the code, which is the author. So the author becomes a coded function, which is more often than not penal in quality. Okay, so in our culture, and doubtless in many others, discourses are not originally a product, or discourse was not originally a product, a thing, a kind of goods. It was essentially an act placed in a bipolar field of the sacred and the profane, the licit and the illicit, the religious and the blasphemous. Historically, it was a gesture fraught with risks before becoming goods caught up in a circuit of ownership. This is a really important and complex definition of discourse. So what Foucault is doing over here is his historicizing discourse. So he's saying that it's absolutely clear, absolutely certain that in our society, and doubtless in many more societies, discourse was originally not an act but a process. Again, an asymmetric entanglement, a phrase that I use often, an asymmetric entanglement of the sacred and the profane, the secular and the religious and the blasphemous, the legal and the illegal. So discourse was an entanglement, was a messy mixture of different things. Before it began an entity, before it began a commodity, before it began a frozen entity, which one can have ownership on. So it became a commodity much later, it became an entity much later, but before that it was an activity, an entanglement, a process of becoming and unbecoming and rebecoming. So this idea of the discourse as a process, this idea of the discourse as a phenomenon of becoming and unbecoming and rebecoming is what Foucault is examining over here. And he said historically, if we are to historicize discourse, any discourse for the matter, we find out that every discourse has a process of becoming before it becomes the product, which can be owned, appropriated, misappropriated, etc. Right? Before it becomes a product, it's a process of becoming and unbecoming, and it's a very messy process, oftentimes where seemingly contradictory fields collide and collude and mix. Okay, so discourse becomes, so it is historicized in this particular section by Foucault, and we can see how discourse can appear as a process, a phenomenon, an activity, a messy activity, a very complex activity before it becomes a commodity, right? So this activity state of discourse, this activity phenomenon, this activity quality of discourse is something that Foucault is highlighting over here. Now, once the system of ownership for text came into being, once strict rules concerning author's rights, author-publisher relations, rights of reproduction, and related matters were enacted at the end of the 18th and beginning of 19th century, the possibility of transgression attached to the act of writing took on more and more the form of an imperative peculiar to literature, right? So once the author function was codified through a very hardcore legal system. So, for instance, we talk about authors having copyrights over certain content. Authors, again, copyright is one way of saying you're accountable for that particular content. Authors having a sense of ownership over a certain content. Again, ownership can be seen as a legal code. So this particular content is written by someone X, Y, Z. And if that content is offensive or transgressive, then X, Y, Z could be held accountable for it. So again, we have a process of coding over here, a process of penal coding, which is very legal in quality. So if you look at the entire industry of authorship, so authorship or authority or the author function becomes an industry post 18th century. And interestingly, for those of us interested in literature, we find this is also a time when the novel comes into being. So the rise of authorship and the rise of the novel as a genre are almost simultaneous in terms of historical time. And the novel, as we know, if you read the history of the novel is a very bourgeois phenomenon. It was a very mercantile phenomenon. It coincided with the rise of the merchant class. And the novel was a commodity from the very inception. So the novel as a book, as a commodity, is a post-printing press phenomenon. And because it's a post-printing press phenomenon, it was completely in collusion with capitalism, in collusion with the market economy. And hence, it was absolutely essential that the novel, the writer of the novel, the author of the novel had to be codified, had to be a discursive function, which would be economically underpinned as well. So the author of a novel would get certain money as royalty. So if a novel is selling well, the author gets money as royalty. The author gets copyright of the content. The author gets copyright for the reproduction of the content, etc. So it becomes a very hardcore legal economic system. It becomes enmeshed with certain legal economic principles, authorship and literature. So literature becomes increasingly legalized. So the entire idea of literature changes post the phenomenon of the author. The literature becomes a legal activity to a certain extent. So if you write a book and if it sells well, you get money because you're entitled by law to get money. Likewise, conversely, if a book is offensive, if a book offends people, then there might be a libel suit against you, and you as the author would face that libel suit. So, I mean, you can think of many examples in literature. For instance, James Joyce's Ulysses is a classic case in point, which is banned in several countries, including the United States of America, where it was banned from publishing. It's only much later, in the 60s, that it was actually circulated for consumption in the USA. And you can think of Thomas Hardy's novels, D.H. Lawrence's novels. I mean, there are several writers, more recently, Salman Rushdie, Taslim Nasreen. So many writers who have faced censorship, who have faced banning, who have faced, public outrage because they're authors of a certain book, the content of which is offensive. So the entire legal tracing goes back to them. They can be traced back legally, they can be quoted back legally, and therein lies the author function as a discursive function in modern times. So it becomes, writing took more and more the form of an imperative peculiar to literature. So the possibility of transgression attached to the act of writing becomes an imperative peculiar to literature, because literature becomes an author function post-18th century, post-19th century. It is as if the author, beginning with the moment at which he was placed in the system of property that characterizes our society, compensated for the status that he does acquire by rediscovering the old bipolar field of discourse, systematically practicing transgression and thereby restoring danger to a writing that was now guaranteed the benefits of ownership. So you can see the words which are used by Foucault: property, transgression, benefits of ownership. So these are very legal economic terms that we see enmeshed with the idea of authorship, with the idea of author function, especially when it comes to literature. Okay, so and then he will go on to look at how the author function differs from between the field of sciences and the field of literature. So the author of a scientific book is different in terms of ownership, in terms of legality, in terms of penal coding, compared to the author of a literary book. And he'll map all the differences in some detail very, very soon. So he goes on to say, and this should be on the screen again, the author function does not affect all discourses in a universal and constant way, however. In our civilization, it has not always been the same types of texts that have required attribution to an author. Now he's going to talk about the different genres of work. So for instance, if someone's writing a book in chemistry, the idea of authorship of a book in chemistry is quite different from the idea of authorship from a novel about a particular period, right? So again, we're looking at different kinds of authorship, different orders of authorship, as it were, and Foucault is very careful in mapping out the differences over here. And obviously, one of the really important, remarkable things about this particular essay is this constant historicization of whatever it's saying. So every idea is historicized, every entity, every phenomenon is historicized in this particular essay, and therein lies the very rich historical quality of this particular essay. So not only is it theoretical, not only is it deliciously post-structuralist, but also it's very deeply and very, very systematically historical in a way it is elucidating or examining the ideas that the essay contains. So it's talking about different times in which texts functioned apropos of authorship in different ways. So there was a time, and I quote, there was a time when the texts we today call literary, narratives, stories, epics, tragedies, comedies, were accepted, put into circulation, and valorized without any question about the identity of the author. Their anonymity caused no difficulty, since their ancientness, whether real or imagined, was regarded as a sufficient guarantee of their status. So this is obviously a pre-printing press phenomenon. It's talking about classical times, which is obviously times, Greek and Roman times, before the advent of the printing press, before the advent of capitalism, before the advent of the bourgeois novel, etc. So in that time, during that particular historical period, the texts which you now call literary, for instance, epics, stories, tragedies, comedies, they were put into circulation, valorized, consumed without any problem, without any question about the author function, without any question about who wrote those books. Okay, so that question was not really that important at that point in time. Now, what was important at that point of time was the idea of ancientness. So we could say, for instance, the Iliad is written by Homer thousands of years ago. So the ancientness, the timelessness, or rather you might say the ahistorical quality of the text were sufficient guarantee of their veracity, right? So the veracity very paradoxically dependent on the timelessness or ahistorical status, right? So there's no historical or causal relation between the writer of the text and the content of the text at that point of time. Now, on the other hand, those texts which we now call scientific, those dealing with cosmology and the heavens, medicine and illnesses, natural sciences and geography, were accepted in the Middle Ages and accepted as true only when marked with the name of the author, right? So, interestingly, and he's going to say in a minute, we'll see how this entire discursive marking is reversed in modern times. But now it's talking about ancient times, medieval times, where literary texts need not have an author, did not need to have an author. So they were ancient texts, they were holy texts, they were religious texts, they were sacred texts. So there was a degree of sacrality attached to literature. There was a degree of sacredness and holiness and ancientness associated with literature, which completely disregarded the author function to a great extent. However, at that time, it was the scientific texts which require the author function much more immediately. So people ask, for instance, Foucault would say, Hippocrates said, or Pliny recounts. So Pliny, Hippocrates, so these are names which were markers of veracity, markers of truth in scientific texts. So scientific texts required authors in the Middle Ages. Scientific texts were only accepted as true or with some degree of veracity if they had an author function, an operative author function. You can failing which they will not be accepted or acknowledged as scientific texts at all. Okay, so texts of medicine and illnesses, natural sciences, geography, cosmology were accepted in the Middle Ages and accepted as true only when marked with the name of the author. So the name of the author was more important for the scientific text rather than for the literary text, which did not require any author function at all. The literary texts would just they would just require ancientness, a degree of sacrality associated with the ancientness, which gave them their ontological status. Okay, so Hippocrates said, or Pliny's recounts were not really formulas of an argument based on authority. They were the markers inserted in discourses that were supposed to be received as statements of demonstrated truth. So they would only be accepted as demonstrated truth only when they had the marker of an author. So Hippocrates or Pliny, they were markers of veracity, markers of authority. Right, and only when the authority was there, only when the marker of authority was there, would these texts be considered and consumed as textbooks of science, true textbooks of science. Okay, so this was ancient times, this was classical times that Foucault examines, and now we see a complete reversal of what happens post print capitalism, post 18th century, and it says quite clearly, and it should be on the screen again. A switch takes place in the 17th or 18th century. Scientific discourses began to be received, for themselves in the anonymity of an established or always demonstrable truth. Their membership in a systematic ensemble and not the reference to the individual who produced them stood as a guarantee. So, this is quite a dramatic shift which takes place in 17th or 18th century, where the membership or the association of the scientific text in a systematic ensemble, that was good enough for the veracity, that was good enough for the truthfulness, the textual truthfulness. So the author function was unimportant at all. It began to recede in terms of significance. Okay, so it could be anonymous. The author function could be anonymous. It did not matter so much, etc. So as Foucault says, they began to be received for themselves. So scientific texts began to be received or acknowledged for themselves. They could stand on their own ground, as long as they were situated in a system of ensemble, right? In a systematic ensemble, and the reference to the individual became secondary. The reference to the ensemble became more crucial. So they are situated in an ensemble of other discourses, inside a map, inside a landscape of other discourses, other scientific discourses. As long as they're situated within that particular map, within the particular field, the individual author function became secondary for scientific texts. And this is 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, so the author function faded away, and the inventor's name served only to question a theorem, proposition, particular effect, property, body, group of elements, or pathological syndromes. The particular inventor's name was just a to Christian a theorem. So you could say this particular theorem has a particular name, and that name belongs to the inventor, that name belongs to the author of that particular theorem or formula or effective property or pathological syndrome. However, the syndrome could stand on its own. It did not really require any real author function as long as it existed within a particular discursive field, right? And that location in the discursive field becomes all important for scientific texts in 17th and 18th centuries, okay? So we can see there's a switch happening because we just saw a few minutes earlier how Foucault examines in the ancient times, in the Middle Ages, no theorem or no scientific text to be accepted as true unless it had an author function. Okay, but by the time we come to 17th or 18th century, science becomes a discursive field, and all that's required of a new text is to be located, or is to have some correspondence, is to have some kind of a dialogue with that particular discursive field. As soon as they have that dialogue, the author function becomes secondary. It doesn't matter who invented it, it doesn't matter who authors it, as long as it has some kind of a dialogic relationship with the existing or dominant discursive field. Okay. But what happens to literature is very important, right? Just the reverse happens to literature, right? So we saw in ancient times literary texts could just stand on their own because of their ancientness, because of sacrality, etc. But in 17th and 18th centuries, literature texts could only exist if they had an author function. Okay, and this is what Foucault says quite clearly. By the same token, literary discourses came to be accepted only when endowed with the author function. We now ask of each poetic or fictional text, from where does it come from? Who wrote it? From where does it come? Who wrote it? When? Under what circumstances? Or beginning with what design? So, the origin, the inception, the source becomes all important for literary text. So we ask these usual questions, these very conventional questions. Who is the author of this particular text? Where does it come from? What are the material conditions which produce this text, etc.? What are the contextual conditions, on the other hand, in other words, which produce this particular text, etc. So context, authorship, source, origin, inception, material conditions, these become very important questions when it comes to literary or fictional texts. The meaning ascribed to it and the status of value accorded to it depend on the manner in which we answer these questions. So, the meaning of a particular text could only be derived from the contextual conditions that are being questioned. Name of the author, the discursive condition, the material condition, the historical condition, etc. So all these become all important rather, for the text. So literary text cannot stand on its own anymore. It has to emerge out of a particular author function, and the author function becomes the dominant discursive marker for literary texts post 17th and 18th century. Okay. And if a text should be discovered in a state of anonymity, suppose we have a text which is anonymous, we don't know who wrote the text, whether as a consequence of an accident or the author's explicit wish, the game becomes one of rediscovering the author. So it becomes a bit of a discovery game. So if a text emerges which doesn't have the name of the author, it could be due to an accident, maybe the author passed away or something, or it could be a deliberate decision on the part of the author, where the author doesn't want to reveal themselves in the text. So if that is the case, if that phenomenon takes place, the entire thing, the entire reading of the text is completely invested into the discovery of the author. So we need to find out who the author is, and that becomes the sole hermeneutic strategy to a certain extent. Okay, since literary anonymity is not tolerable, we can accept it only in the guise of an enigma. So literary anonymity is like a vacuum. It cannot stay. Nature abhors vacuum. So interpretation abhors anonymity. We can have a sort of parallel way that Foucault is proposing. So literary anonymity is not tolerable. We can accept it only in the guise of an enigma. So an enigma becomes a hermeneutic destination. So enigma becomes a quest to find the author. So the absent author becomes an enigmatic presence in the literary text, and the entire reading is then geared towards or directed towards finding out the author through the reading of the text. As a result, the author function today plays an important role in our view of literary works. So our view of literary works, our perspective or opinion on literary works is overdetermined to a great extent by the function of the author or the author function. These are obviously generalizations that would have to be refined insofar as recent critical practice is concerned. Criticism began some time ago to treat works according to the genre and type, following the recurrent elements that are infigured in them as proper variations around an invariant that is no longer the individual creator. Even so, if in mathematics reference to the author is barely anything any longer but a manner in naming theorems or set of propositions or sets of propositions, in biology and medicine, the indication of the author and the date of the work play a rather different role. It is not simply a manner of indicating the source, but of providing a certain index of reality in relation to the techniques and objects of experience made use in a particular period and in such and such laboratory. So the author function in biology and medicine, they have a very different kind of a discursive function compared to the author function in literature. Okay, so it becomes a marker of technique, it becomes a marker of laboratory, it becomes a marker of experimentation, etc., but not the individual marker, not the biographical marker. Okay, so the biographical ontology of the author becomes more important, or one might say, it becomes more ontologically dense when it comes to literature or literary texts compared to texts in sciences, texts in medicine, etc. So that was the second function. The third characteristic of this author function is that it does not develop spontaneously as the attribution of a discourse to an individual. It is rather the result of a complex operation that constructs a certain being of reason that we call author. Okay, now this is becoming a very important definition. We're looking at author as a discursive construct. Obviously, it is a result of a complex operation that constructs a certain being of reason that we call author. So author becomes a reasonable constructor, construct a reason. And we just saw a little while ago how Foucault had examined quite closely the collision between the idea of the author and the penal code, the legal code. So the author has a legal function, the author has a legal marker of a particular text. So it becomes a construct of reason to a great extent. Critics doubtless try to give this being of reason a realistic status by discerning in the individual a deep motive, a creative power, or a design, the milieu in which the writing originates. So, conventional criticism talks about deep motive, the motivation of the author, the creative power, the imagination of the author, or the design of the text, etc., or the milieu, the design of the milieu, the condition in which the writing originates. So these are the dominant markers when it comes to reading a text. Okay, the motivation of the author, the creative power of the author, the imagination of the author which is examined, or the design, the discursive apparatus of the cultural conditions of the milieu, so the surroundings, the context which produce the text. Nevertheless, these aspects of an individual in which we designate as making him an author are only a projection, in more or less psychologizing terms, of the operations we force text to undergo. The connections we make, the rituals, the traits we establish as pertinent, the continuities we recognize, or the exclusions we practice. So these become markers, these become psychologizing terms in which the author function is projected. So the author function is projected using these particular terms: imagination, the motivation, contextual conditions, etc. These become the markers of projection of the author function. Okay. All these operations vary according to periods and types of discourse. We do not construct a philosophical author as we do a poet, just as in the 18th century we do not construct a novelist as we do today. Still, we can find through the ages certain constant in the rules of author construction. So it talks about different kinds of author constructions dependent on different historical periods. So it says the way a philosophical author, for instance, the way we will construct the author function of Nietzsche will be quite different from the way we construct the author function of James Joyce, or the way we would construct the author function of Daniel Defoe in the 18th century will be very different from the way we will construct the author function of Daniel Defoe in the 21st century. So it depends on the milieu, it depends on the genre, it depends on the discursive field through which the author function is constructed. Okay. However, Foucault argues we can still find through certain ages certain constants. There are certain constants in the rules of author construction. So, nevertheless, there are certain constants that we can sort of dig up, that we can excavate, that we can mark as commonalities of author function across periods, across different genres. Okay, so we'll stop this lecture at this point today, and we'll continue with this very interesting essay. I'm sure you'll agree in the next lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.